Mood lighting, nice. Good afternoon. Welcome students, faculty, staff, and friends of the college. My name is Matt Bell, and I'm the Executive Director of Programs for External Affairs here at the college. A long-standing tradition at Hillsdale is to play it safe and to avoid topics of controversy. Thus, it is my privilege to open this first CCA of the academic year, Critical American Elections. In Federalist 68, Alexander Hamilton writes about the genius of the framers of our Constitution in the mode of electing the president. They disperse power not only by making the Electoral College a temporary body, but also by spreading the votes out geographically, avoiding one central place of election. Hamilton writes that the framers did this because, quote, nothing was more to be desired than that every practicable obstacle should be opposed to cabal, intrigue, and corruption, which he calls these most deadly adversaries of Republican government. A similar type of geographical diffusion was also employed by the framers in Article 1 of the Constitution by putting states in charge of who could vote for representatives and state legislatures in charge of appointing senators. Of course, we know that this matter of choosing senators was destroyed in the Progressive era with the 17th Amendment. However, the other provisions have largely remained in force for more than 230 years. As we meet today, cabal, intrigue, and corruption have infected our country so deeply that the future of our republic is uncertain. Bills are being drafted and passed in the House and Senate that would effectively abolish the electoral system we have known by federalizing election law. The 884-page H.R. 1 of the current Congress seeks to expand voter registration, e.g. automatic and same-day registration, and voting access, e.g. vote by mail and early voting, and imposes limits on removing voters from voter rolls. Luckily, the Senate has stopped this bill, but it is likely only a matter of time before this or similar laws get rammed through in reconciliation or by rewriting the rules of the Senate. In the Declaration of Independence, or as our current president likes to call it, quote, you know the thing, close quote. In the Declaration, directly after the founders explained the fundamental rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they tell us how these rights are to be protected. Quote, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, right? This foundational right of consent is what is being contested, and in many cases has been brazenly stripped away right now, not only in the halls of Congress, but at every level of government and throughout society as a whole. Consent is removed or threatened when elections fail the crucial tests of being free and fair. One man, one vote. If we lose that, we lose Republican government. We meet this week while we are still able, and by the way, Hillsdale College will continue to meet despite unconstitutional suggestions from the governor or the president or anyone else. Thank you, thank you. We meet to learn about contested elections throughout American history and also to learn about the most recent election, which was neither free nor fair, so that we can be educated in the hopes of saving our country. The student who will introduce our speaker this afternoon is Nick West, a senior from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, studying applied mathematics and physics. Please welcome Nick to the podium.
Hello, everyone. Dr. Kevin Portteus joined the faculty of Hillsdale College in 2008 and is the Lawrence Fertig Professor of Politics and Director of American Studies at Hillsdale. He previously taught at Belmont Abbey College near Charlotte, North Carolina, and Mountain View College in Dallas, Texas. He earned a Bachelor of Arts degree, summa cum laude, from Ashland University, majoring in political science and mathematics, and took his Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy degrees in politics from the Institute of Philosophic Studies at the University of Dallas. His research interests are in the political thought of the early American Republic, Congress, and the administrative state. His work has appeared in numerous scholarly and mainstream publications, including American Political Thought, the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association, American Greatness, American Mind, The Federalist, Forbes, and Human Events. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Portteus to the stage.
Thank you very much, Nick, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming today. I hope that you find this to be educational and informative, and especially when we get to some of the later speakers, inspiring and revealing. Thank you also to Doug Jeffrey and Matt Bell in our External Affairs office for your very kind invitation to participate today, and also for the opportunity to go first. Which is very useful in this circumstances. If you're familiar with those who are coming after me, it will be much less difficult for Michael Barone and Charles Kessler to emerge from my shadow than it would be for me to emerge from their shadows. So a chance to go first before they show up. But let's be honest, right? When you signed up for this program, when you decided you were coming here, all of you said to yourselves here in 2021, man, I really hope that we get to talk about the political crisis of the 1790s. Right? That's what you had in mind. I know it. Right? Well, here we are. On the other hand, this is exactly the point, that the 2020 election has compelled us to think about elections and political legitimacy in a way that most of us probably have not for a long time, because the kind of electoral political conflict that has characterized most of American history seems natural and normal to us, but it's not. Right? It's not automatic. These norms are not automatic. They don't happen on their own, and despite their seeming normalcy in America, they are not historically normal, and they are not normal today around the world. The norm is and always has been violence, repression, conflict, tumult, accusations and counter-accusations. Right? And it's important for us to understand, to go back to the beginning of our electoral political system and to realize that it almost didn't work here. Right? What we have almost didn't happen. The political conflict of the 1790s, which is where we're going to begin today, almost tore the country apart. And it almost tore the country apart, I think, because in large measure, we didn't quite understand how self-government was actually supposed to work in practice. It was a lesson. It was a lesson that had to be learned. We had to figure out how self-government was actually supposed to operate. And the precariousness of this model was laid bare a couple of generations later in the election of 1860. So we're going to look at these two elections in comparison with one another and see then, when we look at the latter one, how it is that a large portion of the country refused to accept results that they considered to be adverse, that they didn't like. Right? And in doing so, not only threatened to separate the country into North and South, but also threatened to undermine our perception and, as we shall see, the world's perception of how electoral politics in a republic was supposed to work. That is to say, the viability of the Republican system, not just our system, but the very idea of government by consent, right, was at stake in these elections. Right? Now, these are problems that occurred at two particular points in American history, in much earlier American history, but they reveal to us enduring problems of self-government, problems that we today are confronted with. And so let's turn to those and see if we can't discern anything that will help us to understand later elections, and in particular the election just passed. Right? Now, in order to understand the significance of these two elections, we need to go back a little further even than 1800 and the 1790s and understand the foundation of the concept of government by elections. And that's something that Matt very nicely pointed out, takes us all the way back to the Declaration of Independence, the idea that all men are created equal. The very first principle of the founders' political thought, the first self-evident truth listed in the Declaration. Now, we have to be aware that when they said all men are created equal, they meant specific things. Right? They did not intend to declare all men equal in all respects, as Abraham Lincoln will say later on in his speech on the Dred Scott decision. And there are numerous documents that back this up, that say, right, that list specifically the ways in which we are created equal. Equal in certain inalienable rights, right? But not equal in a variety of other respects, in pretty much every other respect. And all we have to do is look around and see the differences among us to know that that's not the case, right? That we are not equal, and the founders were not meaning to assert that obvious untruth, that everyone is equal in all respects. But they did mean it in this one respect. Right? Now, this idea of natural equality has significant downstream consequences for the way that we organize political society. Right? The political consequence of the equality principle is that no one person, no human being has an inherent right to rule another man. Right? The way that Jefferson puts it at the very end of his life is this: the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. Right? And so no human being has that right. If all men are created equal, then in order to govern you, if I were to wish to govern you and you were to wish that I would govern you for some inexplicable reason, I would have to obtain and you would have to freely give your consent. And so we get to that passage in the Declaration of Independence which declares that governments, as Matt pointed out, derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. So government then, legitimate government, is the result of some kind of agreement, compact, contract, right? The person who would rule must obtain the consent of those who would be ruled. We collectively are part of civil society in this understanding, the same society, and under the authority of the government because somehow, and we could get into all kinds of discussions about how this comes to be, we consented to it, right, in some way. Now, right, again, we tend to think of this, to the extent that we think of this, as kind of just the way things are, right, or at least we should. But again, right, this is kind of a radical idea. The idea of all men are created equal and then derived from that government by the consent of the governed is really radical. It's a pretty new thing, right? The old view, right, if you go back to England centuries before, was by divine right. Right? The king rules, the ruler rules by the grace of God in some way. And we are his subjects by birth, right? In other words, birthright citizenship. Right? If you are born on the soil of that ruler, then you are subject to him as a debt owed for the protection that he gave you when you could not protect yourself. Right? But we turned around, as Jefferson points out in the summary view of the rights of British America, we turned around and said, no, king, you are king because we say you're king, and for no other reason. And then 2 years later, of course, in the Declaration of Independence, we withdrew that consent, right, for the reasons stated. All right, so we have a basic principle, but again, how do you make it work? Right? How do you, I hate this, I hate using words like this, operationalize self-government? Right? Because the traditional problem that writers on Republican government have identified is once you put the people in charge, then they fight amongst themselves. Right? So the problem that you run into, to use their language, is that republics are destroyed by factional conflict. Right? Different groups struggling for power, right? Each convinced the other is a threat. right? And unable to reconcile their differences. Right? So ultimately, that tears a republic apart. And so the traditional solution, and this is very well articulated, for instance, by the anti-federalist writer Brutus, is that republics should be homogeneous. That is to say, you should only have one interest. Right? Now, the way that they attempt to do that is by making republics small. To get down to the point where you don't have such a range or a number of people that you get the kind of diversity of interests that leads, in this understanding, to factional conflict. But this solution is rejected openly in the Federalist. Right? In Federalist 9, in Federalist 10, Hamilton says in Federalist 9, look, yeah, that's nice, but how has that worked historically? And the point is that republics, Hamilton asserts, have not succeeded. So if all we can do is replicate their failure, what are we doing here? We have to try something different, and that something different is articulated by Madison in Federalist 10, where he makes the argument for a large republic. He takes the homogeneity argument and flips it entirely on its head and says, no, we don't want to get down to one interest. That's impossible. Right? And anyone who's ever been married knows that's impossible. Right? As soon as you get two people, you are going to get disagreement. Right? So let's accept that reality and build on it. Right? So he says, let's have instead of saying, well, the ideal is get small, get homogeneous, no. Let's take the large republic that we have and make a virtue of it. And we make a virtue of it by encouraging, expecting that there are going to be lots of interests. And if we have lots of interests, then it's going to be much harder for any one interest to be able to organize itself and hold itself together and act long enough to dominate and oppress the rest. Right? So that's the idea. Okay? But easier said than done. Or old habits die hard. Right? So they knew this, right? So at least some people knew this. Now, this is not to say everybody embraced Madison's view. Far from it at the time. Right? So, but at least some people knew that people would have different opinions. But I think that collectively, they didn't quite know what to do with that fact. Right? How does that actually work? While others retained the traditional view that republics should be homogeneous. Right? They didn't quite understand that that parties are not necessarily the same thing as factions. Right? In other words, not every disagreement is a matter of irreconcilable core fundamental principle. Now, at first, these problems were muted. Right? The gap between supporters and opponents of the Constitution was largely, not entirely, largely closed by an agreement whereby anti-federalists, at least enough of them, would back ratification, and in return, federalists would back a Bill of Rights, right? Which ended up, that's what happened, right? Remarkably for our politics, both sides kept their word. Right? And we got a ratified Constitution, and we very quickly got a Bill of Rights. Right? The first Congress began in nonpartisan tones, and Washington was elected president. But very soon thereafter, two sides began to emerge. Right? And within our own politics, the point of friction was a policy program put forward by Washington's Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, to get the country on a sound financial footing. Right? Things like figuring out what to do with the national debt, figuring out what to do with state debts, the national bank, and all of the controversy surrounding that. And Hamilton's program triggered impassioned resistance, particularly, at least at the start, from Virginia. People like Jefferson, James Monroe, John Taylor of Caroline, James Madison, William Branch Giles, all vigorously opposed the Hamiltonian economic system. And it was this opposition that gave rise to our first political party, the Democratic Republicans, or the Republicans for short at the time. Now, don't confuse those with today's Republicans. Right? If anything, the Republican Party of the 1790s evolves into the Democratic Party of today, although that's not to say that today's Democratic Party is in any sense the party of Jefferson or of Andrew Jackson. Let's not make that mistake either. Okay? But there's a problem, right? So you're organizing yourself as an opposition party, but you're in a country that's still got a lot of people that think that we need some homogeneity in republics. That is to say that dissent or organized opposition was a great evil. So if you're the Republicans, how do you get around that fact? And the way that they did it was to convince themselves, rightly or wrongly, and I think mostly wrongly, that the Federalists were monarchists and aristocrats, and that they were bent on subverting republicanism in America. That the Hamiltonian program was designed to implement Walpolean corruption into the American system, to enrich and empower speculators, stock jobbers, as they called them, bankers and financiers, at the expense of the plain people of the country, at the expense of tradesmen and farmers and laborers. Right? And so in their minds, the struggle against federalism was a reenactment of the revolutionary struggle of the 1760s and the 1770s, with the Federalists playing the part of the British government. And Jefferson's rhetoric in this time very strongly reflects that. There's a very strong similarity between the way he talks about the Federalists in the 1790s and the way he talks about the British in the early 1770s. Right? So it's a very interesting correlation. Right? But there was a problem, another problem for the Republicans. Right? What do you do if a faction controls the government? Because they see the Federalists as a faction. Now, what did they do the last time? Well, ultimately what they did was revolution. Right? The traditional mode of resistance, right, is to resist with a capital R, up to the point of being willing to use extra legal means to overthrow the government. And Jefferson himself is, throughout his life, is sentimental, and I think in some ways disgustingly so, about revolutions. Right? The tree of liberty has to be watered from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants, and he accepts, Jefferson does, revolution as a natural, normal, necessary part of Republican politics. Right? But he's somewhat exceptional. Right? I think that the authors of the Constitution thought that they were putting revolution behind them as a method for resolving disputes by filtering political conflict through the Constitution. Most other founding fathers were less sanguine about revolutions, but what was the alternative? Right? In traditional Republican terms, what was the alternative? And all of these divisions in America were aggravated dramatically by the French Revolution and the American reaction to the French Revolution. Now, initially, Federalists, Republicans, right, across the political spectrum in America, almost universal enthusiasm for the French Revolution. But over time, as that revolution descends into madness, it becomes a kind of touchstone for where you are in America politically. Right? Federalists grew at first skeptical and then openly hostile, while Republicans remained supportive, seeing France as a sister republic. Right? And Jefferson himself, with that sentimentality about revolutions, would excuse virtually every bloody excess of the French Revolution. Right? So what you've got now is a situation where both sides look at each other and see a faction. Right? They believed, Federalists and Republicans alike, they both believed that their opponents were hostile to the principles of the American founding, that they were seeking to deprive the other of their inalienable rights. The Federalists looked at the Republicans as fanatical Jacobins, right, who were bent on destroying Christianity, bent on destroying social order, and possibly, in good Jacobin fashion, liquidating their opponents. And so they interpreted opposition to the Federalist-dominated government as sedition, as an attempt to undermine the legitimacy of the constitutional regime in America. Now, the Republicans, on the other hand, understood the Federalists as monarchists and aristocrats who were intent on destroying Republican government and restoring British-style rule, if not British rule itself, subservience to Great Britain. They interpreted events like the Jay Treaty in the mid-1790s as a surrender to British influence, a calculated attempt to reduce America to fawning subservience to the old mother country. And so if these sides are correct, if the opposition is in fact a faction, the only way to secure justice is to destroy the faction. Right? And indeed, that's what happened to the Tories during the American Revolution. Now, they weren't liquidated, but many of them, many of them were chased off, harassed, persecuted, and so on. Now, in 1798, the crisis comes to a head. Right? The XYZ affair, the growing conflict with France, right? Republicans demanded that the Adams administration release documents relating to the XYZ affair because they thought that that was going to make the Adams administration look bad. Adams complied, and it blew up in the Republicans' faces. It, in fact, made the Republicans look really bad. And by this point, the Federalists had had enough. They were exasperated with a decade-long campaign in the Republican newspapers. And the Republican newspapers had waged a vitriolic anti-administration press campaign for many years. And so they finally concluded that the Republicans were undermining the country's faith in its public officials and that this was going to destroy the country, and so they passed the Alien and Sedition laws. Okay, which were an attempt to solve the problem. Now, how do you think that the Republicans responded to this? Well, this is all a prelude to the restoration of monarchy and tyranny. Right? And one can understand why they would think that. Right? But by 1798, Jefferson and Madison thought that they had found a way around the problem. That is to say, how do we get around the idea of resisting the existing government without resorting to revolution or simply submitting? And the solution they thought they had figured out was interposition. Right? We're going to use the states to interpose their authority between the citizens of those states and the tyranny of the Federalist-dominated federal government. It's a legal means, they believed, sanctioned by the Constitution, so that those out of power could leverage the state governments to secure their rights. Now, there are problems. The first of which, of course, is that the interposition argument is based on a pretty debatable constitutional argument, right? that can easily be understood as an attempt, as a kind of rearguard action by anti-federalists to get us back to the Articles of Confederation. Right? But it's also unclear what's meant by interposition. In Madison's hands, it looked like the states acting together to coordinate activity to achieve electoral change. In Jefferson's hands, it looked like nullification. And those doctrines, the Republican response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which are known to us as the Virginia resolutions and the Kentucky resolutions, would come back to haunt us when employed decades later by Southerners as the theoretical and historical justification for nullification and later secession. And of course, in the name, ultimately, of protecting slavery. And so that gets us then, after all this, to the election of 1800. Right? Long story short, Jefferson is elected in a very close and contentious election. But then something remarkable happens. Right? Jefferson, after winning, delivers his first inaugural address and puts an entirely different spin on what's happened. Now he says, this has been a highly charged election. No kidding. Which is probably strange to people who aren't used to free government. Now, in a sense, you could say this is the magnanimity that only the victorious can have. Right? But now that it's over, it's time for us to turn toward the promotion of the common good, upon which we all agree. And this is stunning. Right? It's a recognition, on the one hand, that the electoral process is the proper place for working out these disagreements. Right? On the other hand, he recognizes that the defeated Federalists have rights, which we must respect. He says, the minority have their equal rights, which equal law must protect, and to violate would be oppression. So we're not going to treat these defeated Federalists the way patriots treated the Tories. Moreover, he recognizes, and this may be the most stark recognition of all, this is a quote, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. Right? This is a recognition that the Federalists are not a faction, that both sides are committed to the same set of principles, even though they disagreed. And he proceeds to state those principles. Right? The protection of individual natural rights and the devising of policies to achieve that, while avoiding partisan specifics. The election of 1800 showed the nation and the world that the way to resolve political differences in a republic is through elections. The two sides contest the election. They seek to maximize their support. Each side recognizes the legitimacy of the other. The victors control the vanquished. The vanquished go home and go about their lives unmolested and free to contest future elections. And so Jefferson's first inaugural address is an expression of this realization, that parties are not necessarily factions, that the Federalists and the Republicans didn't disagree about republicanism. They didn't disagree about natural rights. They disagreed about how best to govern and what policies would best secure the rights that we all agree on, the republic that we share and cherish. But there's a wrinkle, and that is this. At some level, there has to be a common conception of justice undergirding all the parties. And so what happens when this disintegrates? And so that's what we need to turn to right now. So the problem, of course, that leads us up to the election of 1860, the root problem, I just gave it to you, is the problem of slavery. Right? The slavery problem was always the elephant in the room, and everybody knew it. Contrary to our friends at the 1619 Project, slavery wasn't the foundation of America. It was always a gross contradiction of American principles, and everybody got that, or virtually everybody got that. Right? Collectively, they understood that. And America's founding fathers did much to constrain it, but for a variety of reasons, some noble, some less noble, slavery survived. And over time, slavery wrought a transformation in Southern society. Right? Over time, the South went from being a constitutional republic to an aristocracy to an oligarchy. The entire society in the South, came to be organized for the sake of the planter class. And so when I use those terms, we think we know what a constitutional republic is. An aristocracy, in Aristotle's view, is just the rule of the few for the sake of everyone. An oligarchy is the rule of the few for the sake of themselves. And that's what you got by the middle of the 19th century in the slave states. And the more the South became committed to defending slavery, the more slavery transformed their system and their way of life. The South became, in a very real sense, a kind of police state. All opposition to slavery was prohibited, either formally through laws or informally through social pressure, by real social pressure, like leave or we'll kill you social pressure. By the 1850s, basic liberties like freedom of speech and protection against warrantless search and seizure were abandoned, so that one country was becoming two, based on wholly different and mutually exclusive principles. So that in the North, you have more or less, this is imperfect, don't overstate it, more or less a retention of the system of the founding, right? Republicanism, political equality, free labor, social mobility, dynamic economy, increasing levels of education. And in the South, you have a new political system whose foundation was slavery. Oligarchy, a rigid political and social caste system, a static economy, slave labor, right? And lower indicators of education across the board. Now, for a time, right, in the 19th century, we successfully ignored this. Right? The Jacksonian party system of the 1830s, 40s, and into the 1850s was predicated on, to the greatest extent possible, ignoring the slavery problem. The Democratic and Whig parties were national coalitions and organized around other issues like banking, infrastructure, and tariffs. And it worked for a while. It worked because they happened to be in a world where, for a generation, there really wasn't any territory added. Everybody accepted the existing arrangements, the Constitution, the Northwest Ordinance, the Missouri Compromise, and we were fine, sort of. Right? Free and slave states were mostly admitted in pairs to preserve a kind of balance. Right? But this began to fall apart with the acquisition of territory in the far west. Right? The Mexican Cession, the Oregon Country, and this created a deadlock that wasn't solved until 1850. But even that was short-lived, because only a few years later, that balance, which everybody proclaimed as loudly as they could was a finality, was shattered by the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. The Whig Party disintegrated. It was unable to deal with the new reality. And the Democratic Party became captive to its southern wing in a way that really didn't change for more than a century after 1854. And as a result, slavery became the issue. In other words, everything began to reorganize itself politically along sectional lines, north and south, free and slave. Right? And the other result of this, besides what happened to the Whigs and Democrats, was the emergence of the Republican Party, an avowedly anti-slavery party, a coalition of groups united by their desire to oppose slave power oligarchy. Even the very name Republican indicates how they understood themselves. And they repeatedly, before, during, and after the war, referred to the Old South as an oligarchy, quote unquote. So they're the first anti-slavery party to become a major party. Meanwhile, the South is becoming increasingly intransigent. Right? Toleration of dissent declines, right? There are threats of disunion all over the place, including threats of personal violence, and it did happen on occasion. Right? Charles Sumner attacked on the Senate floor by Preston Brooks of South Carolina. And this was the atmosphere in which the election of 1860 took place. Right? A four-way race, which was really, the country had become so separated by this point, two-way races. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas running against each other in the North. Right? So it's no extension of slavery, Lincoln. Popular sovereignty, let the people decide in each locality, Douglas. And then in the South, John Bell, the Constitutional Union candidate, whose unofficial platform was unionism, and John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Democratic candidate, and nobody could quite say this, but on a disunion platform. In other words, it was understood that a vote, if you were in the South, that a vote for Bell was a vote for union, and a vote for Breckinridge was a vote for disunion, somehow or other, whatever that looked like. Right? Now, the result of that four-way race, of course, is that Abraham Lincoln wins with, as far as I know, the lowest popular vote percentage of any winner in American history for the presidency. Right? Just shy of 40% of the popular vote. But it was all concentrated in the right places. He won free and clear majorities in enough free states to win the election, even with only 40%. Even if the other 60% had all been given to one candidate, right? Lincoln still wins. Right? Okay. And so the result of this, of course, is that southern states begin to secede, and they give a variety of reasons, but the one that really, you can see this in the documents, the one that really stands out, the real complaint, the straw that breaks the camel's back, is the election of Lincoln on an anti-slavery platform. Southerners warned each other, when talking to each other, that Lincoln's election constituted a mortal threat to their way of life. In other words, that the Republican Party, with Lincoln at its head, was, in their minds, a kind of faction that was bent on destroying the South. For the first time, the North had proven that it could elect a president without a single Southern electoral vote. And this election, they say, constitutes a revolution. They argued that it was no longer possible to preserve their way of life within the Union. That is to say, the South looked at the election, they looked at Abraham Lincoln, and they said, "Not my president." They were willing to accept the constitutional order, a constitutional order which they, frankly, had dominated for 70 plus years, but only so long as it produced results that they liked. Or, to use Lincoln's words from early 1860, quote, "You will rule or ruin at all events." So, at the outbreak of the Civil War, then, Lincoln tells Congress that our political system, republicanism with a small r, is the reason why our people are free and prosperous to an extent never seen before in human history. And his claim is that the southern states, the seceding southern states, are bent on destroying this. He points out they have adopted a Declaration of Independence which omits all men are created equal. Now, for Lincoln, that's it. Right? He describes the equality principle as my ancient faith, or the sheet anchor of American and republicanism. And in another place, he calls it the father of all moral principle in us. He says they have adopted a constitution which replaces we the people with we the delegates of the sovereign and independent states. And so he asks the question, why? Why are we pushing the people and the rights of the people out of the picture? Right? Why are we doing that? And his conclusion, he says, they want to suppress the rights of man and we want to protect them. Republicanism and oligarchy. This is not simply a rebellion. It's a rebellion against republicanism with a small r, against natural rights, against eternal justice. Right? So in other words, we became two countries, right? Morally, in terms of the way we understood the world. Right? And each side viewed the other as a faction. Now, I think that in this case, right, you compare 1800 and 1860, in the 1790s, the Republicans and Federalists looked at each other and saw a mortal danger where there wasn't one. Right? But I think that by 1860, the two sides were right to look at each other and see mutual incompatibility. Because republicanism and oligarchy, freedom and slavery, are incompatible with one another. Now, to wrap this up, because I know we're getting short on time, how does this apply? Right? Now, some of this is going to be covered by other people, but since I'm here, I get to seed the room with my ideas to prejudice you against future speakers. So, I would suggest to you that, in decisive respects, our situation is much like that that was faced by the country in 1860, and that should be a terrifying thought. We no longer share a common conception of justice. Again, more or less, one side, however haltingly, however inconsistently, adheres to the old standards. And the other side seeks revolutionary transformation in the form, on the one hand, of what you might call neo-Marxism, which is to say critical theory, critical race theory, which you've heard about, right? And all of the other attempts to undermine and to reconstruct social order, right? Whether it takes the form of critical race theory or LGBT activism, right? These are all attempts to deconstruct American civilization as a prelude to rebuilding something that they would like better in its place. And at the same time, oligarchy, right? The rule of a few, of an elite class, right? Which the progressives, I would suggest, set in motion. Right? The legitimacy of the regime is in question, right? In a way that it has not been in a long time. Right? The left has embarked on a campaign to delegitimize all opposition, right? With several years now of political and sometimes actual warfare, right? Even to the burning of cities. A concerted effort to brand all opposition racist, sexist, white supremacist, or domestic terrorist. Now, on the other side, the right is increasingly convinced that the electoral system is illegitimate because it is rigged. And whether that's true or not, that perception is extremely dangerous to the survival of the republic. Chris Chalitza at CNN reported this week that 52% of Americans now doubt the legitimacy of our elections. The same poll reported earlier this year that that number was only 40%. Right? That's an extremely toxic situation, right? Where you have mutual incompatibility of principles, right? Where you have what Lincoln described 70 years ago, I'm losing track, 160 years ago, as a house divided. Right? If anything, right, it might be even more terrifying. Right? In 1860, there was a fairly bright line in the country that separated one side from the other, and that no longer exists. But, right, like I said, this is an extremely toxic situation, but we've been there before. And so I think it's useful to start here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to do that, because if we think about these old elections, we can better understand our own situation. And perhaps, this time, we can avoid the fate that befell the country in the aftermath of the election of 1860. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Portteus. We now have time for a few questions. If you have a question, please make your way to one of the microphones. Student questions are encouraged.
So at this point, I will say, though, that you can see the extent to which my power over this room has evaporated. I didn't even get the chance to say that myself, so I relinquish authority, and I'm now at the mercy of the microphone, so thank you. I was that good? Or that bad? No? Who wants dinner? Oh, here we go. I say, okay, there we go. Now we're getting somewhere. I saw a couple of hands. No? Nowhere?
Thank you, Dr. Portteus, for your time and for your experience and understanding about our past. You suggested, or you stated outright, that in the 1860 election, there was a clear dividing line that doesn't exist today. Mm-hmm. You don't think that well, could you explain why the moral and political views of the different sides today are not a line that is separating us?
Yeah, I should clarify that. Thank you. That's actually really useful because I was unclear about that. In the antebellum period, up until the Civil War, what I meant by a line was there's a physical boundary, and you could more or less count on, whether you lived in Michigan or Mississippi, you could pretty much count on your neighbor sharing your view. right? And so what that meant was each side was safe within its own community, right? The situation that obtains today, I think, is not like that. You can't be certain that your neighbor, nearly as certain that your neighbor is on your side. That is, in that sense, it much more resembles previous civil conflicts like the English Civil War or the Spanish Civil War, and that's a terrifying thought too, right? Where, especially, out here, I feel pretty comfortable about where I'm at, right? And if I lived in Manhattan, I would know what was going on there too, right? I tell my wife, anytime I go to Ann Arbor, my dominant thought is, how do I get out of here, right? Because I know that if people, and I've been forced to, for personal reasons, go there several times lately, I know if the people there knew what I was, that I might actually be in danger. But especially those of you that live in the suburbs, right? That is to say, on the boundaries between where the different groups have congregated. That's a very dangerous situation, right? Because you don't know. Your neighbor might be your friend and he might not be, ideologically. And so that's a much more fragmented situation. No, the ideas are clearly a dividing line, but the physical line doesn't exist that used to, at least not in the way that it did in this previous conflict. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you. I'm sorry to have not been clear about that. Yes, ma'am.
This is a little away from the elections, but you said something about Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
And writing the Declaration. We had the opportunity to go to Monticello this week.
Uh-huh.
And some of the guides had a little, like they pointed out, he had over 600 slaves during his lifetime, but
Right.
he only freed 10, I think, by the end of his life.
Mm-hmm.
And I still cannot reconcile how he made that masterful declaration, and you kind of touched on a little bit.
Sure.
Is there anything that you might add that would help?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so never underestimate the power of human beings to be inconsistent, right? I don't know where you were this morning, but I know where I was, and there's a reason why Christians need confession, right? I mean, the very concept is a testament to the fact that we act in ways that are inconsistent with our principles. And I think that in Jefferson's particular case, that sort of split in his mind is testament to the poisonous effects that slaveholding can have on even the noblest mind, right? If we take Jefferson as that, and let's just do that for the sake of the argument, you can see what it does to him. And Jefferson, in his case, Jefferson had a couple of loves, and that was books and wine. If you've ever been to Monticello, you also know that his passion for wine was such that he invented a kind of dumbwaiter system to get the wine from the cellar to the kitchen more rapidly, right? So that he and his guests could enjoy it without interruption. And years ago, I got to go to the Library of Congress and one of the exhibits that they had was a selection of Jefferson's personal library, which he had donated to the country after the library was burnt during the War of 1812. And it's incredible. And one can only imagine the expense. Right? Well, look, in order for him to enjoy those things, right, he needed someone else to do the work for him. And that became a problem. And Jefferson, like many slaveholders as a result, had debts. Right? So that even if he had tried to liberate his slaves, for instance, in his will, the probate courts would have showed up and said, no, you don't. Right? Because he would have been obligated, the estate would have been obligated to liquidate those debts. And that was a very common situation for plantation owners, because when times were good, they spent, and when times were bad, they borrowed. Right? And so it was a common phenomenon for large slaveholders to die in substantial debt. So that's probably a longer answer than you needed, but there we go. So.
Okay, I'm Ray, and I want to. You spoke on the bit with the factions. Mm-hmm. Having many factions results in a government that is good, because the factions will cancel one another out, mm-hmm. and the majority of what's good will be good. Well, I wanted to present you with a radical idea that under today's current situation, that assumption that the factions will cancel each other out is being challenged.
Absolutely.
Because I think that it is a flawed argument currently. I think we don't know who the factions are currently, and I'd like to get your expansion on that.
Yeah, if I can, make sure we're doing okay on the time here. Somebody's going to tell me when we're out of time, right? We're good. Okay. There, Matt's telling me, yeah, we're good. Like I said, anyway. Madison, in discussing this problem of what he calls multiplicity of interests, has a very telling passage buried in Federalist 10, right? And he says, for all of this difference, right, he says, justice ought to hold the balance between them. Right? And I interpret that to mean that this multiplicity of interests only works if commonality of principle obtains at the same time. That is to say, different interest groups can pursue their different interests as long as that does not result in such a dramatic difference of understanding of justice that the two can't coexist together. There has to be something, going all the way back to Jefferson, there has to be something that unites us as a people. And this is something we were just covering in my intro class. And for many societies, that something is blood. Right? Well, that doesn't really work for us, and it never did. Right? Because of who we are, right? That's just not, right? That's not who we are. And there have been attempts in American history to kind of gin up a kind of shared blood ancestry or mytho-historical, right? People like Rufus Choate, the Whig politician in the middle of the 19th century, tries to fabricate a kind of organic basis for American unity, but this doesn't work, right? Even in the mid-18th century, we're too diverse for that, right? And so what unites us is an idea, right? A shared understanding of justice. And that is, my advisor in college was a Hungarian refugee. He and his family escaped in '56 when he was 10 years old. And his father said to him that they were going to America because they were born Americans just in the wrong place. Right? Now, that does not confer upon anyone a right to come here. There's no right to be here, and there's no right to citizenship. Right? Those aren't, because there's no such thing as citizenship outside of, anyway, outside of the American regime. So, but it does mean that in principle, anyone who shares the idea may become part of the regime. Right? Anyone who can live according to it, who can internalize it, who shares it, right? Even if there's not common blood ancestry. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy, right? But it's possible. But it only works if we share it, right? And so if a large portion of the country, either by education or importation, adopts alien ideas, in this case I would suggest various neo-Marxist ideologies, then you have a problem. Right? Then, because that's more fundamental than difference over promoting the manufacturing interest or the agricultural interest or some subset thereof. So, okay.
We have time for one final question.
Hi, Dr. Portteus. Thanks for your lecture.
Thank you.
I was wondering, given the extent to which some of the conflict in the 1800 election went, even structural things like how you allocated electors, how far can conflict in the electoral system go before that would be deemed revolution?
Wow. Couldn't have saved that for class on Tuesday, right? Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, and I feel like I don't want to be repetitive, and I apologize if I'm being repetitive. You can call me on that. It goes back to the idea that the two sides are willing to accept the outcome, which is predicated on the idea that both sides accept the legitimacy of the process, right? And again, that's something that's both in 1860 and in 2020 has been called into question, right? Now, nobody, I don't want to say nobody, but there wasn't mass refusal to accept the results of the 1800 election, right? Even the defeated Federalists ultimately went home, right, and resumed. In other words, they went into opposition, right? But they were allowed to go into opposition, which is a significant thing, and they understood themselves as, hey, we're going to beat them next time, right? In other words, there was a concept established in American politics. In the rest of the English-speaking world, it's referred to as a loyal opposition, right? But both sides accept the legitimacy of each other and of the process, and you have to have those things. Once you transcend that, then in a way, all bets are off. And again, this is what's so potentially dangerous about the situation, right? One side has said the other is by definition illegitimate. The other side is saying, hey, you've corrupted the process, right? And we have severe doubts about, therefore, its legitimacy. So I hope that's satisfactory. Okay, I'm getting a thumbs up. I'm good. All right, thank you all very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of the week.